dangerous to both the USA and the world. We are faced with two choices.
You heading now? Okay. Love you. Drive safe.
are not living in a nation where left-wing parties hold 80 out of 200 seats in a congressional body, or even 8 out of 200. This is a huge nation, dominated by the most reactionary and violent ruling class in the history of the world, where the majority of the people just simply cannot understand that they are existing on the misery and discomfort of the world. They have been hypnotized into believing that criticism of the expansionist policies of imperialism is really isolationist or injurious to both the USA and the world. We are faced with two choices: to continue as we have done for 40 years, fanning our pamphlets against the hurricane, or starting to build a new revolutionary culture that will be able to turn on the old culture. Collectively, we have that choice. The black colony, as it sits out here alone, has no such choice. In a report from Jonathan Jackson in early 1970, he said, "We are not going to wait until the USA attacks the people of the USA, or Angola, Mozambique, or any of the other African nations in foment. We can't wait. We shouldn't even allow this thing to happen in Indochina, Bank of America, Chase Manhattan, First National City of New York, Irving Trust Company, the Morgan Monopoly, Manufacturers Hanover Trust, Continental Illinois National Bank, First National Bank of Chicago, Bankers Trust Co., and a dozen lesser firms all have great financial interests in the USA now." In 1966, the USA investment in one small African nation was $667 million. It's almost doubled since then. In 1968, 70 to 75% of all goods from the USA entered the USA duty-free. Soon we'll be asked to fight the people of the USA because they're getting their people's army together. No, I'm not waiting for them to attack a new part of Africa or Asia. I'm entering the war now, on the side of the Vietnamese. The black colony USA has little choice. We must enter the war on the side of the majority of the world's people, even if it means fighting the USA majority. We fight to live, and we're learning to fight. It'll be a war to the knife if necessary. We can't wait until the generation that thinks of blacks as N-words and the rest of the world as GOOKS, CHINKS, SPICS, etc. has been educated away. It may be the reverse that happens. We N-words and GOOKS may be blown away first, or if we survive, what will we inherit? A desert? We'll mass what people we can. Perhaps that won't be the whole lower class. We'll mass ourselves and any ally we may be able to draw from the whole class structure, and will attempt to wage war on property and property rights. Essentially, that is the fight. But even then, some men will die, as in all forms of war. But if we cannot draw that support that is necessary for such a war, then we see a positive benefit for the majority of the world's people in the reduction of this whole country to a vast wasteland and a graveyard for 200 million of history's most damnable fools. In People's War, urban style, each political move toward organizing people around their realistic needs will support a corresponding military move. This unity of politics and war will increase the overall revolutionary consciousness by degrees to a point where mass consciousness can be said to exist. The Black Panther Party is the largest and most powerful political force existing outside establishment politics. It draws this power from the people. It is the people's natural political vanguard. Now let us assume the existence of a small, tightly knit, totally committed and separate military vanguard, such as Jonathan Jackson attempted to build. Jonathan was my brother and closest comrade. I knew him. He was the real super N-word. He worked at it, hard. He took complete control of himself. He learned every weapon in the human arsenal, from the flying side thrust foot attack and the quick draw snapshot to the manufacturing use of the mortar. He knew 6,000 ways to kill a man, 30 with the simple stroke of an empty hand or foot. He was 17 years old when he died in the service of the people, on the side of the black colonies, and with the courage of the whole colonized world. Let's assume where Jonathan is concerned that our battle cry reaches some receptive ear and another hand reaches down to take up our weapon. We have two perfectly harmonious fists, the left front ram of the Black Panthers' political thrust and the left back ram of the August 7th movement. Let's further assume that this nation is one huge city that we can call by its rightful updated name, Johannesburg. This clarifies the understanding of urban people's war, the concept of the true internationalism, and the connections, interactions, processes, and effects of a people at war under the leadership of a vanguard, which wields a double-edged sword against an isolated enemy element. All the cities of this country can be treated as one interconnecting entity, due to the necessity of exchange and interactions caused by specialization. We can now deal with them as a single entity because of the national character of the vanguard party and revolutionary consciousness within the inner black colony. All Anglo-Western cities are generally the same when they are reduced to the critical features that support them. I could be talking about London, New York, Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, Paris, Berlin, or Rome instead of Johannesburg. Mao pictured the USA as the city of the world surrounded, besieged, and slowly strangled to death by a third force under arms. Using Mao's theoretical springboard, I wish to make further comments on the hypothetical super-technological city-state and its vulnerability. Any honest expert in the overall strategy and logistics of classic Western mechanized warfare, the war of the industrially based established state, will admit that the scientific guerrilla force must be outnumbered 10 to 1 in manpower by the mechanized force if it is to be contained at all. The establishment army, the defenders of property, of the industrial complex, armed with the tools and weapons of heavy industry, must feel 10 men for just one guerrilla. This point is a strong indication of the relative effectiveness of the two fighting styles. Recent reports, March of 1971, coming in from the Indo-Chinese theater, describe such debacles as 80 US 40-ton tanks racing in wild retreat before the guerrillas. Puppet soldiers and USA mercenaries, in their haste to disengage from the people's forces, are lashing themselves to the runners of rescue helicopters. Disaster for man with the most and best equipment is threatening and imminent. Now is the time for us to fill the streets with our protest, clog the tunnels and back stairs of covert totalitarian government with every weapon at our disposal. The effectiveness of rallies and mass demonstrations has not come to an end. Their purpose has diacritically altered, but the general tactic remains sound. Today, the rally affords us the opportunity to effect intensive organization of the projects and programs that will form the infrastructure of our communes. If the mass rallies close, as they have in the past, with a few speeches and a pamphlet, we can expect no more results than in the past. 2 hours later, the people will be Americans again instead of people. But going among the people at each gathering with clipboards and pens and painfully ascertaining what each can contribute to clear-cut, carefully defined political projects is the distinction between intensive organization and the sterile, stilted attempts to build new unions, rank and file, etc., or elect a socialist legislature. However, as we start the projects that will eventually move the workers and the whole community into open conflict with the ruling clique, my own personal observations lead me to the independent conclusion that the political vanguard and even its early project need to be defended. Clearly, the political cadre needs protection from the enemy culture's military, its secret police, and vigilante death squads. Armed struggle is at the very heart of revolution. If the problems of the people cannot be redressed because the necessary resources are in the hands of a relatively few families and individuals, it means we are going to have to seize the property. Seizing property has always meant some form of war, some form of armed struggle. If history is our guide, it clearly records that nothing of any great value has ever changed hands without a struggle, or at least a show of or threat of violence. Men simply don't surrender what they think of as their privilege and property except by force. History itself is economically motivated class struggle. There is simply no way to compare this society or its historical experience with that of a tiny colonial country like Chile. Allende is not seizing property, his government is buying property. Until the Chilean ruling capitalist class is suppressed, the Chilean revolution is as meaningless as the Swedish experiment. Socialist governments which attempt to coexist with capitalist economics completely forget the economic motive of human social history. Revisionism has given birth to countless socialistic hermaphrodites, always to the detriment of people's power. Strained, tortured definitions of social existence and organization have trapped the people in so many contradictions that most have given up all hope of harnessing the modern industrial state or even understanding it. England, before the Tories or between the Tories, is liberal socialist. Military dictatorships, clearly totalitarian, are ruled by cliques traveling under the designation Revolutionary Council, etc. No argument has any substance if it conflicts with the objective conditions, the clear, incontrovertible facts. In our case, these facts can be read from the nation's dailies in the obituary section. Blacks who seriously advocate revolution are killed. Blacks who attack property relations are slated for the graveyard or the prison camp. It's a national cultural tradition. Since these are the facts, it follows that an oppressed class which does not strive to learn to use arms, to acquire arms, only deserves to be treated like slaves. We cannot forget, unless we become bourgeois pacifists or opportunists, that we are living in a class society, that there is no way out of this society, and there can be none except by means of the class struggle. In every class society, whether it is based on slavery, serfdom, or as at present on wage labor, the oppressing class is armed. The vanguard cannot stay alive long enough to effect a broad consciousness unless it possesses the latent threat of force. They're going to claim that our clothing projects, the people's bazaars, the people's stores, and decentralized cottage industries are fronts for stolen property. The establishment will claim that the vanguard party is feeding and clothing people with goods stolen from the old enemy culture. They'll claim that we're buying it from the city-states lumpen, who steal everything they can sell, or that we're ripping it off ourselves. Of course, this will be used to justify an attack upon our political projects, our infrastructure. The assaults will be justified by them in a dozen different ways, whether we establish ourselves in storefronts or in our homes. They will attack us behind the fire ordinance, the sanitation department, the anonymous tip. The establishment's mercenaries will break in shooting, and all of us who are not killed will go to jail for violating the fire ordinance, resisting arrest, attempting murder, and receiving stolen property, etc. It's as predictable as nightfall. I'm convinced that any serious organizing of people must carry with it from start a potential threat of revolutionary violence. Without it, the establishment forces will succeed in isolating the political organizer and closing down his project before the people can feel its benefits. Self-determination requires a small, hidden, highly trained army equipped with the very best and most destructive of military weapons and a bodyguard of counter-terrorists. The vanguard party distinguishes itself in the service of the people and superimposes itself over the old culture throughout the city-state. Tactics designed to further the development of revolutionary consciousness must be based upon the prevailing state of class and race antagonisms created out of the new relationship. We can be certain that the nucleus of a clandestine army will already exist by then. The government's repressive agencies will also be well infiltrated by blacks and other revolutionary people. Infiltration is the work of the professional revolutionary. Infiltrating the establishment's protective agencies will also tend to neutralize the ruling class's attempt to isolate the Black Vanguard commune from the larger body of the class structure. All efforts to isolate the Vanguard community must be resisted. The Black colony must actively invite other revolutionary people to follow their example. We must give refuge to the refugees and eventually work out some means to coordinate our operations with theirs at every level. However, we cannot delay our own preparations toward a united Black revolutionary culture. No one will undertake to aid us unless they sense the power of our movement. It is Blacks who must play not only the role of liberating the Black colony, but also the leading role in the liberation of the whole city-state. To expect that someone else will take the full responsibility for our own liberation is suicide. We'll be asked to be patient for another 100 to 150 years. We'll get stuck with long theoretical explanations on consciousness or objective conditions when it's clear that consciousness will not grow unless there is someone among us willing to feed it. Consciousness grows in spirals. Growth implies feeding and being fed. We feed consciousness by feeding people, addressing ourselves to their needs, the basic and social needs, working, organizing toward a united national left. After the people have created something that they are willing to defend, a wealth of new ideals and an autonomous subsistence infrastructure, then they are ready to be brought into open conflict with the ruling class and its supporters. This conflict must extend to every level of capitalist production and distribution. Consciousness of our power will grow as a result of this mass contact with the ruling forces. There is no question that people must be organized and educated to the benefits of people's government before they can successfully move against their class enemy. However, there seems to be some question as to how seriously we should take ourselves and our work of organizing. When we meet resistance, should we acquiesce, withdraw, wait it out, or intensify? Should we meet violent reaction with a more determined violence? The type that put 80 tanks to flight in Laos. In other words, if the fascists don't like what we're doing and attack us through a lynch mob, the police forces and judicial branch of their government, should we relent? Or should we accept their violent reaction as a natural response to our challenge and organize against it? Every step, every stage toward a unified Black commune will meet great resistance. This resistance will come in some form of violence. It is clear that if we don't learn to overcome all resistance, no forward movement will be made. Discovering ways of meeting and overcoming resistance, demonstrating to ourselves that we can, is a fundamental antecedent to the growth of revolutionary consciousness because we'll be under attack every step of the way. 100 years ago, it would have been the same. 100 years from today, it will be the same. We'll take our mule and 40 acres now, collectivize them, defend them, invite other revolutionary people to follow our example, make allies, then leap to destroy the fascist pseudo-mass culture from within. As the people move into more significant areas of anti-establishment projects, they will be hurled violently into contact with the defenders of the present state of property relations at the level of production, distribution and property rights in general. Then we will discover that their power and their new fighting style actually depend on their greater potential for violence. The size and complexity of a thing are not an index of its strength. This struck me forcefully one evening as I flipped through one of the nation's news weeklies and spotted a photograph of a huge self-propelled 155mm cannon lying on its side, its barrel spiked forever. A man on foot, armed with a rocket that weighed less than 4 pounds, had destroyed it. The larger and more complex the city-state, the more it is dependent upon all related parts. The cannon was hit at its base, in the moving parts of its treads, which were destroyed, and the death machine fell of its own weight. How can the super-technological state operate without electricity or power, without water, transport, communications, sewage systems, utilities. None of these can be protected. Their sheer size alone makes it impossible. How can the establishment protect an electrical supply line and the thousands of transformers, etc.? Effective positioning of the guards is militarily impossible. A man every 25 feet up and down the million miles of line can't protect it. It would also break the class that paid for the protection, since a break at any one point renders powerless huge sections of the area served. The cost of supporting the guards would bankrupt any nation. The guerrillas would simply overwhelm the guardians point by point. I think this is the essence of the poor man's war, the essence of the guerrilla strategy, the protected war of the worker bees. The only valid form of union activity is seizure of union leadership by any means necessary. We must call strikes to enforce our demands on capital. To enforce the strike, we must stop the plant's power source. Standing in the gateway with a placard and a pamphlet alone will not dull a worker's short-term interest in wage slavery. The very first impulse is to eat. With right-wing union leadership gone and the black worker revolutionized through his contact with the black commune, even the fascists who exist without any sense of community or class consciousness can possibly be won over or at least rendered neutral. Either way, they won't be able to break strikes with the power lines down. The power of our military strategy sitting beside our political infrastructure depends on constant attack, improvisation, aggression, an attack on property, the utilities that feed the superstate, indirect and direct attacks at the productive point and distribution system. As I stated, the Western military experts admit that the mechanized establishment guard must outnumber the attacking worker by 10 to 1. What they cannot afford to admit is that even with this numerical superiority, they cannot win. They're learning this in every theater of combat. In a class war, they could never even raise a 10 to 1 numerical superiority. Even if they succeed in employing the degenerate elements of the lower class, created by a long history of counterpositive mobilization of reactionary mass society, as mercenaries or vigilantes in the early stages, the advantage is still ours. At 10 to 1, we still enjoy a strategic military superiority if we are attacking, because they must defend so many different points vital to the order and continuity of their life support system, all at the same time. The points to be protected will always outnumber the units who are available to protect them. The super-technological city-state has grown so complex that it is completely dependent upon its thousands of related parts. It has grown so large that no force can be fielded to protect all its vital parts. The essence of the guerrilla technique is to cripple and finally stop the life support system of the enemy class or state. The advantage of the anti-establishment force can be best understood by picturing the need for the establishment forces to spread themselves thin in the vain attempt to protect the mechanical base of their source of power, which, of course, works out to be the various forms of productive and non-productive property. The mobile have-not, the attacker, can concentrate his forces, even though initially they are numerically inferior, to actually outnumber and overwhelm the thinned-out forces of the establishment by attacking at 1 or 2 points at a time. In Mao's selected works, Volume 2, he speaks of ingenuity and mobility as necessary qualities of any guerrilla operation. The ancients said, ingenuity in varying tactics depends on mother wit. This ingenuity, which is what we mean by flexibility, is the contribution of the intelligent commander. Flexibility does not mean recklessness. Recklessness must be rejected. Flexibility consists in the intelligent commander's ability to take timely and appropriate measures on the basis of objective conditions after judging the hour and sizing up the situation. The situation includes the enemy's situation, our situation, and the terrain. And this flexibility is ingenuity in varying tactics. On the basis of this ingenuity, we can win more victories in quick decision offensive warfare on exterior lines, change the balance of forces in our favor, gain the initiative over the enemy, and overwhelm and crush him so that the final victory will be ours. If there are 20 points in the city-state to be protected and 10 units of protection, clearly an attacking force of 1 could destroy 10 of the 20 points without opposition. The 10 points that remain and are guarded by the 10 units of protection must now meet the attacker on a one-to-one basis. The term attack explicitly means first strike, and first strike translates into advantage. Total repression and genocide are not possible if we organize ourselves for survival first. If we first construct the commune, a sense of community, a common interest of class, the objective conditions are present. To postpone our liberation with the excuse that the people aren't ready is to underestimate them. In effect, it's like saying they don't have the mentality to act in their defense. The repeating shotgun is the deadliest weapon in the world for close-range urban fighting. They are simple to make, maintain, and use. Anyone can be effective with the scattergun. One simply points and squeezes the trigger. If the thing to be shot is moving, follow through with your swing. Tanks are obsolete. They can be rendered harmless with $1's worth of grenade, propelled from the muzzle of the shotgun by a blank cartridge. Then, as a tank moves down any city street, it has placed itself in a defile. On a cost-effectiveness basis, the most destructive weapon is the gasoline bomb. Enough gasoline, soap shavings, and potassium chlorate could flip a tank over on its side, or thrown from the windows of our defiles, the gasoline bomb could incinerate the largest army. We can only be repressed if we stop thinking and stop fighting. People who refuse to stop fighting can never be repressed. They either win or they die, which is more attractive than losing and dying. The primacy of politics remains, but we must now prepare for armed confrontation. By no stretch of the imagination can we hope to overthrow so determined an enemy without force. We will win. George. Blood in My Eye by George L. Jackson. The American Mind. Frankenstein's need for a servant was an expression of his diseased ego, so he created a demented, ugly creature, pathologically strong and huge. Dear Greg, the breakdown of establishment conditioning usually occurs first at the university level. Students refuse to accept the lie that our exploitation of the world's peoples is actually beneficial to them. They begin to refuse their share of the spoils. Huey Newton and Bobby Seale left the campus to form the Black Panther Party. The Students for a Democratic Society gave birth to the Weathermen. The rise of socio-political institutions to their present form and complexity was not the result of chance. The corporation, the university, the unions, the mass media, the foundations, the associations, the courts, the prisons, the army, police, national and international, uniformed and disguised, from their beginnings were formulated as enforcers of state centralism. An examination focused on the history of all the major socio-political institutions of the United States, a study in the genetics of hierarchy, would certainly uncover the totally economic motive underlying the foundations of these institutions. For my purpose, I would broadly divide the major socio-political institutions into two classes, one designed by the state to move people into certain actions, and the other to discourage, curtail, or completely deny certain other actions. The unintelligible vastness of these institutions makes it seem impossible that they could be owned and operated by a relatively small number of men, But the truth of this can be demonstrated by documented evidence and irrefutable case studies. The modern, industrial, corporative, city-based state could never function at all without hierarchical control and an acceptance by the people of the controlling hierarchy. Prior conditioning, of course. The effects of ubiquitous self-negation inbred since childhood, of course, again. Certainly, the pervasive nihilism of capitalist man, but these are simply effects. Western civilization is dying because it's tied into an economic system that was decadent 100 years ago. This system was certainly the calculated creation of a specific minority class. The rise of the manufacturing class was not spontaneous. It is perpetuated beyond the stage of decadence in spite of fits of outrageous disorder. Its seemingly remarkable ability to return from crisis is not proof of natural durability. Rather, it is proof of a destructive will to power at any cost. Frankenstein's need for a servant was an expression of his diseased ego, so he created a huge, pathologically strong, demented, ugly creature. He censored the beast's activity by making him under-intelligent. He erected institutions flexible enough to keep the giant working, but rigid enough to forestall any growth of his mental faculties. A brain was grudgingly attached to the beast to provide a way for it to act. The beast worked and fought the enemies of his creator. The beast was content to watch the creator flourish. He lived through his creator, and when he finally saw himself as he was, he went mad. The corporation, the foundation, the association, the mass media, the state-controlled unions, the universities, and primary schools are all designed to move people into very specifically pre-ordered and monitored actions. The actual monitoring is done by a broader segment of the stratified slave state, but the pre-ordering is done by the 0.1%, the ruling class and governing elite of the corporative arrangement. The careful observer can see immediately how the guiding instructions are held together by red tape and rubber bands so that they can be very flexible when necessary. The corporation's flea market and the mass media are relatively new techniques of control, as are the institutional foundations and most of the associations. The foundations, whether family or corporate, are tax-exempt financial mechanisms ostensibly established for altruistic influences in the fields of art and culture generally. They subsidize scientific research, higher education, educational TV, etc. The Rockefellers alone control 13 such foundations, through which they also control the oil holdings of 90 to 100 nations in the third world countries mainly, holdings variously estimated in value from 10 to 14 billion dollars. Similar foundations are controlled by the Fords, Kellogg's, and Carnegies, etc., etc. When the international business interests of these family financial institutions are threatened, the tax-supported international police are activated. After the CIA fails, the special forces are called upon. When necessary, the Marine Corps and infantry intervene. Comrade George. Blood in My Eye by George L. Jackson. American Justice. For their freedom to prey on the world's people, whatever the cost in blood. Dear Greg, in order for capitalism to continue to rule, any action that threatens the right of a few individuals to own and control public property must be prohibited and curtailed, whatever the cost in resources. The international wing of the repressive institutions has spent $1.5 trillion since World War II. Whatever the cost in blood, My Lai, Augusta, Georgia, Kent State, the Panther Trials, the frame-up of Angela Davis. The national repressive institutions, police, National Guard, Army, etc., are no less determined. The mayors that curse the rioters and the looters, Mayor Daley of Chicago has ordered them summarily executed in the streets, ignore the fact that their bosses have looted the world. I refuse to make any argument with statistics compiled by the institutions and associations that I indict. Yet it is true that even official figures prove the case against capitalism. The Federal Bureau of Investigation compiles and indexes almost all information on crime in the United States. I have the figures as it states them right here. Vital Statistics, FBI Crime Report, Property Crimes, 87% of the total in 1969, 28% of these crimes occurring in the ghetto. Since 1960, the number of men and women prisoners in state and federal penitentiaries has fluctuated slightly around the 250,000 mark. These statistics conceal the living reality. This is my 11th year of being shoveled into every major prison in the most populous state in the nation, and the largest prison system in the world. What I have seen in these 11 years is the living situation. The experience is quite different from the columns of figures neatly arranged to give the impression of well-studied, detached, scientific, and calculated analysis. Hidden are the facts that at each institution I've been in, 30 to sometimes 40% of those held are black, and every one of the many thousands I've encountered was from the working or lumpen proletariat class. There may be a few exceptions, but I simply have not met any of them in my 11 years. Where I am confined now in San Quentin Prison, California, awaiting trial for 2 alleged crimes, conviction on either of which would subject my lungs to the poison gas treatment, there are 17 cells in what is euphemistically called the Adjustment Center, but is far more accurately known as the Hole. The AC is San Quentin's triple maximum security, and all of these cells are filled, 11 of them with black men, every one of them without exception from the working class. I've been arrested, interrogated, or investigated more times than I care to count. I've learned 10 times more about the process than the most expert single groups of inquisitors. From the first moment I'm brought into this scenario, I attempt to establish control over the exchanges that will take place between myself and my captors. Depending on the situation, one learns to feign either indignation, surprise, idiocy, or fear. At times, the peasant philosopher face will work. I don't think I am an exception at all, as most blacks learn by age 15 how to handle the cretins who hire out as guns for the privileged. There is only one type of inquisitional situation that I personally cannot control, the sessions that begin with violence. In those cases, guile fails and blacks learn to fight multiple opponents while handcuffed, or at least learn how to protect the groin area. I simply have never managed to develop a technique against 9 armed men who are fascinated with damaging my private parts, but I'm still learning. All black people, wherever they are, whatever their crimes, even crimes against other blacks, are political prisoners because the system has dealt with them differently than with whites. Whitey gets the benefit of every law, every loophole, and the benefit of being judged by his peers. Other white people, blacks, don't get the benefit of any such jury trial by peers. Such a trial is almost a cinch to result in the conviction of a black person, and it's a conscious political decision that blacks don't have those benefits. Howard Moore Jr., attorney official of the court, but not for the court. He's in a position to know. He's honest, black, and dedicated enough to tell. The purpose of the chief repressive institutions within the totalitarian capitalist state is clearly to discourage and prohibit certain activity, and the prohibitions are aimed at very distinctly defined sectors of the class and race-sensitized society. The ultimate expression of law is not order, it's prison. There are hundreds upon hundreds of prisons and thousands upon thousands of laws, yet there is no social order, no social peace. Anglo-Saxon bourgeois law is tied firmly into economics. One can even pick that out of those vital statistics. Bourgeois law protects property relations and not social relationships. The cultural traits of capitalist society that also tend to check activity, individualism, artificial politeness juxtaposed to an aloof rudeness, the rush to learn how to instead of what is, are secondary really, and intended for those mild cases and groups that require preventative measures only. The law and everything that interlocks with it was constructed for poor, desperate people like me. Jonathan, my younger brother, understood this point perfectly. The purport of the raid of the Marin County Courthouse was more significant by far than its calculable effects. I knew him well, since he was and still is my alter ego. He went to liberate and to educate with aggressive and free action. He knew that as he proceeded in liberating there would be more action. He wasn't a speechmaker, and neither am I. Escape from the myth, the hoax, by moving people into action against the terror of the state, counterterrorism, is the real significance of the August 7th affair. To Jonathan, the striking exposure was audacity, audacity, and more audacity. Theory and practice, strategy and tactics were based in his mind on actual confrontation within this particular historical development. He must have calculated that Foucault Army activity that was hidden and nameless, operating where the objective conditions for revolution already existed and had existed for a dozen decades, would survive and grow if, at the same time, the Black Panther political apparatus continued to develop its autonomous infrastructure. Proof of his theory was built right into the action. 5 desperate men were offered arms as a means to freedom. 3 took them. Proof of the role of law within the totalitarian-authoritarian relationship was also built into the action. In a fit of reckless, mindless gunfire, 100 automated goons shot through the bodies of a judge, district attorney, and 3 female non-combatants to re-establish control over all activity. To prevent certain actions, no cost in blood is too high. It would seem that so much free fire would be difficult to explain, but it is not. Freedoms are invariably being protected with this gunfire. Freedom must then be interpreted 1,000 separate ways, but it actually comes down to freedom for a few families and their friends. Freedom to prey upon the world. Acceptance of enslavement is deeply buried in the pathogenic character types of capitalism. It is a result of the sense of dread and anxiety, which is the lot of all men under capitalist rule. Compulsive behavior and disordered obsessional longings are actually made synonymous with character in our disordered society. But to emphasize these conditions before examining the institutions from which they spring is to confuse effect with cause and further cloud the point of attack. So far, cultural analysis has established that the psychosis is so ingrained, the institutions so centralized, that what is needed is total revolution. The armed struggle between the have-nots with their vanguard and the haves with their hirelings or macabre freaks that live through them, civil war between at least these 2 sections of the population, is the only purgative. Total revolution must be aimed at the purposeful and absolute destruction of the state and all present institutions, the destruction carried out by the so-called psychopath, the outsider, whose only remedy is destruction of the system. This organized massive violence directed at the source of thought control is the only realistic therapy. analysis of the oppressed mentality and the psychopathic personality that accrue from contact with the prevarications of American culture must be carefully integrated with the analysis of the source. Simple interpretation of effects tends to calcify. It certainly promotes defeatism. Action makes the front. One can quietly refuse to accept the constrictions of bourgeois culture, can reject himself, hate the self, and turn inward. By so doing, he accomplishes a form of individual revolt. But here again we find another unconscious manifestation of the thing we hate, individualism, a now attitudinal instrumentality of bourgeois culture. We cannot escape. One simply cannot reject constrictions without rejecting and putting to death the constrictor. An armed attacker cannot be ignored. Gandhi and the gurus were all abject fools. I would certainly be dead if, when critical flashpoints matured, I hadn't backed my rejection with blows. I would hate to have been a Vietnamese in my lie without arms. I hate encounters like the one at my last court appearance on April 6, 1971, when the enemies who attacked me had all the weapons. I would hate to run into freaks who have Mike Hammer / J. Edgar Hoover complexes without being armed. My pledge is to arms. My enemies are institutions and any men with vested interests in them, even if that interest is only a wage. If revolution means civil war, I accept, and the sooner begun, the sooner done. I don't think the enemy can be identified any more carefully than this. Further identification must be made in the process. I feel elated that my brother died with 2 guns in hand. I'm going to miss him and all the others, though death in our situation is only a release. I miss people intensely. I miss him intensely. But he and the others who sought freedom died at the throat of the principal repressive institution of the empire. They died making real attempts at freedom. I paraphrase Castro on trial after Moncada. I warn you, gentlemen, I have only begun. Blood in My Eye by George L. Jackson. Toward the United Front. A new Unitarian and progressive current has sprung up in the movement centering on political prisoners. How can this Unitarian conduct be developed further in the face of determined resistance from the establishment? How can it be used to isolate reactionary elements? Unitary conduct implies a search for those elements in our present situation which can become the basis for joint action. It involves a conscious reaching for the relevant, the entente, and especially, in our case, the reconcilable. Throughout the centralizing authoritarian process of American history, the ruling classes have found it necessary to discourage and punish any genuine opposition to hierarchy. But there have always been individuals and groups who rejected the ideal of 2 unequal societies existing one on top of the other. The men who placed themselves above the rest of society through guile, fortuitous outcome of circumstance, and sheer brutality have developed 2 principal institutions to deal with any and all serious disobedience: the prison and institutionalized racism. There are more prisons of all categories in the United States than in all other countries of the world combined. At all times, there are 2/3 of a million people or more confined to these prisons. Hundreds are destined to be legally executed, thousands more quasi-legally. Other thousands will never again have any freedom of movement, barring a revolutionary change in all the institutions that combine to make up the order of things. 1/3 of a million people may not seem like a great number compared with the total population of 200 million. However, compared with the 1 million who are responsible for all the affairs of men within the extended state, it constitutes a striking contrast. What I want to explore now are a few of the subtle elements that I have observed to be standing in the path of a much-needed united front, non-sectarian, to effectively reverse this legitimized ripoff. Prisons were not institutionalized on such a massive scale by the people. Most people realize that crime is simply the result of a grossly disproportionate distribution of wealth and privilege, a reflection of the present state of property relations. There are no wealthy men on death row, and so few in the general prison population that we can discount them altogether. Imprisonment is an aspect of class struggle from the outset. It is the creation of a closed society which attempts to isolate those individuals who disregard the structures of a hypocritical establishment, as well as those who attempt to challenge it on a mass basis. Throughout its history, the United States has used its prisons to suppress any organized efforts to challenge its legitimacy, from its attempts to break up the early Working Men's Benevolent Association to the banning of the Communist Party during what I regard as the fascist takeover of this country, to the attempts to destroy the Black Panther Party. The hypocrisy of American fascism forces it to conceal its attack on political offenders by the legal fiction of conspiracy laws and highly sophisticated frame-ups. The masses must be taught to understand the true function of prisons. Why do they exist in such numbers? What is the real underlying economic motive of crime and the official definition of types of offenders or victims? The people must learn that when one offends the totalitarian state, it is patently not an offense against the people of that state, but an assault upon the privilege of the privileged few. Could anything be more ridiculous than the language of blatantly political indictments? The people of the state versus Angela Davis and Rachel McGee, or the people of the state versus Bobby Seale and Erica Huggins. What people? Clearly the hierarchy, the armed minority. We must educate the people in the real causes of economic crimes. They must be made to realize that even crimes of passion are the psychosocial effects of an economic order that was decadent 100 years ago. All crime can be traced to objective socio-economic conditions, socially productive or counterproductive activity. In all cases, it is determined by the economic system, the method of economic organization. The people of the state versus John Doe is as tenuous as the clearly political frame-ups. It's like stating the people versus the people, man against himself. Official definitions of crime are simply attempts by the establishment to suppress the forces of progress. Prisoners must be reached and made to understand that they are victims of social injustice. This is my task working from within. While I'm here, my persuasion is that the war goes on no matter where one may find himself on bourgeois-dominated soil. The sheer numbers of the prisoner class and the terms of their existence make them a mighty reservoir of revolutionary potential. Working alone and from within a steel-enclosed society, there is very little that people like myself can do to awake the restrained potential revolutionary outside the walls. That is part of the task of the prison movement. The prison movement, the August 7th movement, and all similar efforts educate the people in the illegitimacy of establishment power and hint at the ultimate goal of revolutionary consciousness at every level of struggle. The goal is always the same: the creation of an infrastructure capable of fielding a people's army. Each of us should understand that revolution is aggressive. The manipulators of the system cannot or will not meet our legitimate demands. Eventually, this will move us all into a violent encounter with the system. These are the terminal years of capitalism, and as we move into more and more basic challenges to its rule, history clearly forewarns us that when the prestige of power fails, a violent episode precedes its transformation. We can attempt to limit the scope and range of violence in revolution by mobilizing as many partisans as possible at every level of socio-economic life. But given the hold that the ruling class has on this country and its history of violence, nothing could be more certain than civil disorders, perhaps even civil war. I don't dread either. There are no good aspects of monopoly capital, so no reservations need be recognized in its destruction. Monopoly capital is the enemy. It crushes the life force of all of the people. It must be completely destroyed as quickly as possible, utterly, totally, ruthlessly, relentlessly destroyed. With this as a common major goal, it would seem that anti-establishment forces would find little difficulty in developing common initiatives and methods consistent with goals of mass society. Regretfully, this has not been the case. Only the prison movement has shown any promise of cutting across the ideological, racial, and cultural barricades that have blocked the natural coalition of left-wing forces at all times in the past. So this movement must be used to provide an example for the partisans engaged at other levels of struggle. The issues involved in the dialectic which flows from an understanding of the clear objective existence of overt oppression could be the springboard for our entry into the tide of increasing worldwide socialist consciousness. In order to create a united left whose aim is the defense of political prisoners and prisoners in general, we must renounce the idea that all participants must be of one mind and should work at the problem from a single party line, or with a single party line, or with a single method. The reverse of this is actually desirable. From all according to ability, each partisan outside the vanguard elements should work at radicalizing in the area of their natural environment, the places where they pursue their normal lives when not attending the rallies and demonstrations. The vanguard elements, organized party workers of all ideological persuasions, should go among the people, concentrated at the rallying point with consciousness-raising strategy, promoting commitment and providing concrete, clearly defined activity. The vanguard elements must search out people who can and will contribute to the building of the commune, the infrastructure with pen and clipboard in hand. For those who aren't ready to take that step, a packet of pamphlets should be provided for their education. All of this, of course, means that we are moving, and on a mass level, not all in our separate directions, but firmly under the disciplined and principled leadership of the vanguard Black Panther Communist Party. One simply cannot act without a head. Democratic centralism is the only way to deal effectively with the American ordeal. The Central Committee of the People's Vanguard Party must make its presence felt throughout the various levels of the overall movement. With the example of unity in the prison movement, we can begin to break the old behavioral patterns that have repeatedly allowed bourgeois capitalism, its imperialism and fascism to triumph over the last several decades. We tap a massive potential reservoir of partisans for cadre work. We make it possible to begin to address one of the most complex psychosocial byproducts that economic man with his private enterprise has manufactured, racism. I've saved this most critical barrier to our needs of unity for last. Racism is a matter of ingrained traditional attitudes, conditioned through institutions. For some, it is as natural a reflex as breathing. The psychosocial effects of segregated environments, compounded by bitter class repression, have served in the past to render the progressive movement almost totally impotent. The major obstacle to a united left in this country is white racism. There are three categories of white racists: the overt, self-satisfied racist who doesn't attempt to hide his antipathy, the self-interdicting racist who harbors and nurtures racism in spite of his best efforts, and the unconscious racist who has no awareness of his racist preconceptions. I deny the existence of black racism outright. By fiat, I deny it. Too much black blood has flowed between the chasm that separates the races. It's fundamentally unfair to expect the black man to differentiate at a glance between the various kinds of white racists. What the apologists term black racism is either a healthy defense reflex on the part of the sincere black partisan who is attempting to deal with the realistic problems of survival and elevation, or the racism of the government stooge organs. As black partisans, we must recognize and allow for the existence of all three types of racists. We must understand their presence as an effect of the system. It is the system that must be crushed, for it continues to manufacture new and deeper contradictions of both class and race. Once it is destroyed, we may be able to address the problems of racism at an even more basic level. But we must also combat racism while we are in the process of destroying the system. The self-interdicting racist, no matter what his acquired conviction or ideology, will seldom be able to contribute with his actions in any really concrete way. His role in revolution, barring a change of basic character, will be minimal throughout. Whether the basic character of a man can be changed at all is still a question. But we have, in the immediacy of the issues in question, the perfect opportunity to test the validity of materialist philosophy again, because we don't have to guess, we have the means of proof. The need for Unitarian conduct goes much deeper than the liberation of Angela, Bobby, Erica, McGee, Los Siete, Tijerina, white draft resistors, and now the indomitable and faithful James Carr. We have fundamental strategy to be proved, tested, and proved. The activity surrounding the protection and liberation of people who fight for us is an important aspect of the struggle, but it is important only if it provides new initiatives that redirect and advance the revolution under new progressive methods. There must be a collective redirection of the old guard, the factory and union agitator, with the campus activists who can counter the ill effects of fascism at its training site, and with the lumpen proletariat intellectuals who possess revolutionary scientific socialist attitudes to deal with the masses of street people already living outside the system. They must work toward developing the unity of the pamphlet and the silenced pistol. Black, brown, and white are all victims together. At the end of this massive collective struggle, we will uncover our new man, the unpredictable culmination of the revolutionary process. He will be better equipped to wage the real struggle, the permanent struggle after the revolution, the one for new relationships between men. Blood in My Eye by George L. Jackson. After the revolution has failed, after the killing is done, the ruling class goes on about the business of making profits as usual. On withdrawal. Syllogism. Noun. Argument with two premises and a conclusion. A logical scheme of a formal argument consisting of a major and minor premise, and a conclusion which must logically be true if the premises are true. Merriam-Webster. After revolution has failed, all questions must center on how a new revolutionary consciousness can be mobilized around the new set of class antagonisms that have been created by the authoritarian reign of terror. At which level of social, political, and economic life should we begin our new attack? First, we, the black partisans and their vanguard party, the old and new left alike, must concede that the workers' revolution and its vanguard parties have failed to deliver the promised changes in property relations or any of the institutions that support them. This must be conceded without bitterness, name-calling, or the intense rancor that is presently building. There have been 2 depressions, 2 great wars, a dozen serious recessions, a dozen brush wars, crisis after economic crisis. The mass psychosocial national cohesiveness has trembled on the brink of disruption and disintegration repeatedly over the last 50 years, threatening to fly apart from its own concentric inner dynamics. But at each crisis, it was allowed to reform itself. With each reform, revolution became more remote. This is because the old left has failed to understand the true nature of fascism. We will never have a complete definition of fascism because it is in constant motion, showing a new face to fit any particular set of problems that arise to threaten the predominance of the traditionalist capitalist ruling class. But if one were forced for the sake of clarity to define it in a word simple enough for all to understand, that word would be reform. We can make our definition more precise by adding the word economic. Economic reform comes very close to a working definition of fascist motive forces. Such a definition may serve to clarify things, even though it leaves a great deal unexplained. Each economic reform that perpetuates ruling class hegemony has to be disguised as a positive gain for the upthrusting masses. Disguise enters as a third stage of the emergence and development of the fascist state. The modern industrial fascist state has found it essential to disguise the opulence of its ruling class leisure existence by providing the lower classes with a mass consumer's flea market of its own. To allow a sizable portion of the new state to participate in this flea market, the ruling class has established currency controls and minimum wage laws that mask the true nature of modern fascism. Reform, the closed economy, is only a new way for capitalism to protect and develop fascism. After the German SS agents or Italian black shirts kick in the doors and herd Jews and communist partisans to death camps, after Peg Leg White's Black Legion terror and the Guardian of the Republic and their offspring legitimize the FBI, in other words, after the fascists have succeeded in crushing the vanguard elements and the threat they pose is removed, the ruling class goes on about the business of making profits as usual. The significance of the new fascist arrangement lies in the fact that this business as usual is accompanied by concessions to the degenerate segment of the working class, with the aim of creating a buffer zone between the ruling class and the still potentially revolutionary segments of the lower classes. Corporative ideals have reached their logical conclusion in the US. The new corporate state has fought its way through crisis after crisis, established its ruling elites in every important institution, formed its partnership with labor through its elites, erected the most massive network of protective agencies replete with spies, technical and animal, to be found in any police state in the world. The violence of the ruling class of this country in the long process of its trend towards authoritarianism and its last and highest state, fascism, cannot be rivaled in its excesses by any other nation on earth today or in history. With each advancement in the authoritarian process and strengthening of the ruling class's control over the system, there was a corresponding weakening of the people's and workers' movement. And intellectuals still argue whether America is a fascist country. This concern is typical of the American left's flight from reality, from any truly extreme position. This is actually a manifestation of the authoritarian process seeping into its own psyche. At this stage, how can anyone question the existence of a fascist arrangement? Just consider the awesome centralization of power and the proven fact that the largest part of the gross national product is in the hands of a minute portion of the population. Of course, the revolution has failed. Fascism has temporarily succeeded under the guise of reform. The only way we can destroy it is to refuse to compromise with the enemy state and its ruling class. Compromises were made in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s. The old vanguard parties made gross strategic and tactical errors. At the existential moment, the last revelation about oneself, Not many members of the old vanguard choose to risk their whole futures, their lives, in order to alter the conditions that Huey P. Newton describes as destructive of life. Reformism was allowed. The more degenerate elements of the working class were the first to succumb. The vanguard parties supported the capitalistic war adventure in World War II. Then they helped to promote the mass consumers market that followed the close of the war, the flea market that muted the workers' more genuine demands. Today we are faced with a clearly different set of class antagonisms, the complexities of a particularly refined fascist economic arrangement where the controlling elites have co-opted large portions of the lowly working class. When we ask ourselves, where will we attack the enemy state, we are answered at the productive point. The next logical question is, with whom and what will we attack the fortified entrance of the productive and distributive system and a nation of short-sighted, contented, conservative workers? Obviously, the fascist movement is counter-revolution at its very center. Fascist reformism is a calculated response to the classic scientific socialist approach to revolution through positive mobilization of the working classes. From its inception, the fascist arrangement has attempted to create the illusion of a mass society in which the traditional capitalist ruling class would continue to play its leading role. A mass society that is not a mass society. A mass society of authoritarians whose short-term material interests are perfectly suited to the development of the perfect totalitarian state and centralized economy. The most precise definitions of fascism involve the concept of scientific capitalism or controlled capitalism, a sophisticated, totalitarian, learned response to the challenge of egalitarian scientific socialism. After its successful establishment in Spain, Portugal, Greece, South Africa, and the United States of America, we are faced with the obvious question: how to raise a new consciousness. We are faced with the task of raising a positive mobilization of revolutionary consciousness in a mass that has gone through a contrapositive authoritarian process. The new vanguard elements seem to agree that withdrawal from the enemy state and its social, political, and economic life is the first step towards its destruction. The new vanguard elements seem to agree that the new revolutionary consciousness will develop in the struggles of withdrawal. However, after this point, agreement grows vague and is all but lost in a sea of contradiction. The contention turns on one primary question: the scope and range of violence within the revolutionary process. After the lengthy and clearly unnecessary ideological battle that laid to rest a direct approach to revolution by the white or black worker, we are now faced with an equally unnecessary ideological battle over which of the various communal revolutionary cultural approaches has the stronger revolutionary validity. The problem is compounded by the almost apolitical withdrawal of the growing Weatherman faction and their estranged allies on campus to organic food gardens and a life of sex, music, and drugs. Their Nietzschean Hegelian withdrawal mimics the European historical experience of the last 5 generations. In our equation, this must be considered the minor side of the syllogism. Though revolution is in fashion, the realistic, cohesive synergism seems as yet impossibly remote. On the other side of the equation, we have Huey Newton's concept of black communes set well within the huge population centers of the enemy state. This concept accepts any level of violence that will be necessary to enforce the demands of the people and workers. These communes will be tied to one another by a national and international vanguard party and joined with the world's other revolutionary societies. They are the obvious answer to all the theoretical and practical questions and problems about an American revolution. a revolution that will be carried out principally by blacks. The question I've asked myself over the years runs this way. Who has done most of the dying, most of the work, most of the time in prison on Max Row? Who is the hindmost in every aspect of social, political, and economic life? Who has the least short-term interest, or no interest at all, in the survival of the present state? In this condition, how could we believe in the possibility of a new generation of enlightened fascists who would dismantle the basis of their hierarchy? Just how many Americans are willing to accept the physical destruction of some parts of their fatherland so that the rest of the land in the world might survive in good health? How can the black industrial worker be induced to carry out a valid workers' revolutionary policy? What and who will guide him? The commune, the central city-wide revolutionary culture. But who will build the commune that will guide the people into a significant challenge to property rights? Carving out a commune in the central city will involve claiming certain rights as our own, out front, rights that have not been respected to now, property rights. It will involve building a political, social, and economic infrastructure capable of filling the vacuum that has been left by the establishment ruling class and pushing the occupying forces of the enemy culture from our midst. The implementation of this new social, political, and economic program will feed and comfort all the people on at least a subsistence level and force the owners of the enemy bourgeois culture either to tie their whole fortunes to the communes and the people, or to leave the land, the tools, and the market behind. If he will not leave voluntarily, we will expel him. We will use the shotgun and the anti-tank rocket launcher. Who will build on an ideal that begins with force? The vanguard party is now nationwide, but vanguard parties cannot build revolutions alone, nor can a vanguard party expect a full party line agreement before it moves in the direction of the people. Revolution is illegal. It's against the law. It's prohibited. It will not be allowed. It is clear that the revolutionary is a lawless man. The outlaw and the lumpen will make the revolution. The people, the workers, will adopt it. This must be the new order of things after the fact of the modern industrial fascist state. In blacks, the authoritarian traits are mainly the effects of terrorism and lack of intellectual stimulation. The communal experience will redeem them. At present, the black worker is simply choosing the less dangerous and complicated strategy of survival. All classes and all people are subject to the authoritarian syndrome. It is an atavistic throwback to the herd instincts, but it requires only the proper trauma, the proper eco-sociological set of circumstantial pressures to break forth a revolutionary consciousness. Racism enters on the psychosocial level in the form of a morbid, traditional fear of both blacks and revolutions, the resentment of blacks and conscious or unconscious tendencies to met out pain to blacks throughout the history of America's slave systems all came into focus when blacks began the move from south to north and from countryside to city to compete with whites in industrial sectors and, in general, engaged in status competition. Resentment, fear, insecurity, and the usual isolation that is patterned into every modern capitalist industrial society. The more complex the products, the greater the division of labor, the higher the pyramid, the broader its base, and the smaller the individual brick tends to feel, are multiplied by 10 when racism, race antagonism, is also a factor. There is certainly no lack of evidence to prove the existence of an old and built-in character assassination of programmed racism. What class controls the nation's educational facilities, prints the newspapers and magazines that carry the little cartoons, and omits or misrepresents us to death, has always served to distract and diffuse feelings of status deprivation suffered by the huge sectors just above the black one. Then also to account for the seemingly dual nature recognizable in the authoritarian personality, conformity, but also a strange latent destructiveness. Racism has always been employed as a pressure release for the psychopathic destructiveness evinced by a people historically processed to fear, to feel the need for a decision maker, to hate freedom. The revolutionary is outlawed. The black revolutionary is a doomed man. All of the forces of counter-revolution stack up over his head. He's standing in the tank trap he has dug. He lives in the crosshairs. No one can understand the feeling but himself. From the beginning of his revolutionary consciousness, he must use every device to stay alive. Violence is a forced issue. It's incumbent on him. The very first political programs have had to be defended with duels to the death. The children's breakfast programs haven't been spared. The next round of commune building could cause the third great war of the century. We must build with the fingers of one hand wrapped around a gun, an anti-personnel weapon. We cannot leave the central city. This must be understood by the other revolutionary people if we are to move together to conclusive action. The war will be fought in the nerve centers of the nation, the cities where Angela was finally captured as she was at work for the revolution, where Huey was found hiding and working by the government's propaganda apparatus. We cannot withdraw from the cities. In order to complete the revolutionary syllogism, the fascists must be forced to withdraw, and under cover of the guns which force their withdrawal, we will build the new black communes, a blade in the throat of fascism. Blood in My Eye by George L. Jackson. Fascism, its most advanced form, is here in America. Comrade John, I've just finished rereading Angela's analysis of fascism. She's a brilliant, big, beautiful revolutionary woman, ain't she? I've studied your letters on the subject carefully. It could be productive for the three of us to get together at once and subject the whole question to a detailed historical analysis. There is some difference of opinion and interpretation of history between us, but basically, I think we are brought together on the principal points by the fact that the three of us could not meet without probably causing World War III. Give her my deepest and warmest love, and ask her to review these comments. This is not all that I will have to say on the subject. I'll constantly return to myself and re-examine. I expect I will have to carry this on for another couple of 100 pages. We'll deal with the questions as they come up, but for now this should provoke both of you to push me on to a greater effort. The basis of Angela's analysis is tied into several old left notions that are at least open to some question now. It is my view that out of the economic crisis of the last Great Depression, fascism corporativism did indeed emerge, develop and consolidate itself into its most advanced form here in America. In the process, socialist consciousness suffered some very severe setbacks. Unlike Angela, I do not believe that this realization leads to a defeatist view of history. An understanding of the reality of our situation is essential to the success of future revolutionizing activity. To contend that corporativism has emerged and advanced is not to say that it has triumphed. We are not defeated. Pure fascism, absolute totalitarianism, is not possible. Hierarchy has had 6,000 years of trial. It will never succeed for long in any form. Fascism and its historical significance is the point of my whole philosophy on politics and its extension, war. My opinion is that we are at the historical climax, the flashpoint of the totalitarian period. The analysis in depth that the subject deserves has yet to be done. Important as they are, both Wilhelm Reich's and Franz Newman's works on the subject are limited. Reich tends to be over-analytical to the point of idealism. I don't think Newman truly sensed the importance of the anti-socialist movement. Behemoth is too narrowly based on the experience of German National Socialism, so there is so much to be done on the subject and time is running out. If I am correct, we will soon be forced into the same fight that the old left avoided. 6/20/1971. It is not defeatist to acknowledge that we have lost the battle. How else can we regroup and even think of carrying on the fight? At the center of revolution is realism. To call one or two or a dozen setbacks defeat is to overlook the ebbing and flowing process of revolution, coming closer to our calculations and then receding, but never standing still. If a thing isn't building, it must be decaying. As one force emerges, the opposite force must yield. As one advances, the other must retreat. There is a very significant difference between retreat and defeat. I am not saying that our parents were defeated when I contend that fascist corporativism emerged and advanced in the US. At the same time, it was making its advance. It caused, by its very nature, an advance in worldwide socialist consciousness. When US capitalism reached the stage of imperialism, the Western great powers had already divided among themselves almost all the important markets in the world. At the end of World War II, when the other imperialist powers had been weakened, the US became the most powerful and richest imperialist power. Meanwhile, the world situation was no longer the same. The balance of forces between imperialism and the socialist camps had fundamentally changed. Imperialism no longer ruled over the world, nor did it play a decisive role in the development of the world situation. Vo Win Yap. In my analysis, I am simply taking into account the fact that the forces of reaction and counter-revolution were allowed to localize themselves and radiate their energy here in the US. The process has created the economic, political, and cultural vortex of capitalism's last reform. My views correspond with those of all the Third World revolutionaries, and if taken in the international sense, they are aggressive and realistic. The second notion that stands in the way of our understanding of fascist corporativism is a semantic problem. When I am being interviewed by a member of the old guard and point to the concrete and steel, the tiny electronic listening device concealed in the vent, the phalanx of goons peeping in at us, his barely functional plastic tape recorder that cost him a week's labor, and point out that these are all manifestations of fascism, he will invariably attempt to refute me by defining fascism simply as an economic geopolitical affair where only one political party is allowed to exist above ground and no opposition political activity is allowed. But examine that definition of totalitarianism, comrade. No opposition parties are allowed in China, Cuba, North Korea, or North Vietnam. Such a narrow definition condemns the model revolutionary societies to totalitarianism. Despite the presence of political parties, there is only one legal politics in the US, the politics of corporativism. The hierarchy commands all state power. There are thousands of ways, however, to attack it and place that power in the hands of the people. 6/20/1971. All levels of struggle must be conceived as inclined planes leading inexorably to a point where armed conflict will engulf two or more sections of the people. Armed struggle or organized violence is the natural outcome of a sequence of historical events that have matured to the point of impasse. This is not to say that war is for us the only immediate recourse or the spontaneous result of a breakdown in lesser forms of political activity. I have always tried to emphasize that through every stage of political mobilization, there must be a corresponding and equal military mobilization of the people's forces. One is inextricably tied into the other, and not simply for the reason unwittingly put forward by the old guard that fascism allows for no valid opposition political activity, though there is some truth in that position. My position is based on historical precedents that indicate the probable scope and range of violence in an American revolution. In the present class structure, we represent the group with the greatest revolutionary potential. We are black, the significance of which needs very little analysis here, though I will go into the mechanics of race at length later in dealing with the contextual structure of fascist hierarchy. But mainly, my position is rooted in the long history of the American business oligarchy's penchant for violent repression of any forces that have threatened its centralist movement, and in the very natural defense reflexes of any form of state power. Although as victims of one of history's most brutal contradictions, as the poorest of the poor, as blacks, it is quite justifiable and completely possible for us to destroy this country as a modern nation state, to attack it with a totally destructive counter-sweep of frustrated retaliatory rage. That is not our purpose. As revolutionaries, it is our objective to move ourselves and the people into actions that will culminate in the seizure of state power. Our real purpose is to redeem not merely ourselves, but the whole nation and the whole community of nations from colonial community economic repression. The U.S. has established itself as the mortal enemy of all people's government, all scientific socialist mobilization of consciousness everywhere on the globe, all anti-imperialist activity on earth. The history of this country in the last 50 years and more, the very nature of all its fundamental elements and its economic, social, political, and military mobilization distinguish it as the prototype of the international fascist counter-revolution. The U.S. is the Korean problem, the Vietnamese problem, the problem in the Congo, Angola, Mozambique, the Middle East. It's the Greece and the British and Latin American guns that operate against the masses of common people. 6/21/1971. The nature of fascism, its characteristics and properties have been in dispute ever since it was first identified as a distinct phenomenon growing out of Italy's state-supported and developed industries in 1922. Whole libraries have been written around the subject. There have been 100 party lines on just exactly what fascism is. But both Marxists and non-Marxists agree on at least two of its general factors: its capitalist orientation and its anti-labor, anti-class nature. These two factors, almost by themselves, identify the U.S. as a fascist corporative state. An exact definition of fascism concerns me because it will help us identify our enemy and isolate the targets of revolution. Further, it should help us to understand the workings of the enemy's methodology. Settling this question of whether or not a mature fascism has developed will finally clear away some of the fog in our liberation efforts. This will help us to broaden the effort. We will not succeed until we fully accept the fact that the enemy is aware, determined, disguised, totalitarian, and mercilessly counter-revolutionary. To fight effectively, we must be aware of the fact that the enemy has consolidated, through reformist machination, the greatest community of self-interest that has ever existed. Our insistence on military action, defensive and retaliatory, has nothing to do with romanticism or precipitous idealistic fervor. We want to be effective. We want to live. Our history teaches us that the successful liberation struggles require an armed people, a whole people, actively participating in the struggle for their liberty. The final definition of fascism is still open, simply because it is still a developing movement. We have already discussed the defects of trying to analyze a movement outside of its process and its sequential relationships. You gain only a discolored glimpse of a dead past. No one will fully comprehend the historical implications and strategy of fascist corporativism except the true fascist manipulator or the researcher who is able to slash through the smokescreens and disguises the fascist set up. Fascism was the product of class struggle. It is an obvious extension of capitalism, a higher form of the old struggle. Capitalism versus socialism. I think our failure to clearly isolate and define it may have something to do with our insistence on a full definition. In other words, looking for exactly identical symptoms from nation to nation. We have been consistently misled by fascism's nationalistic trappings. We have failed to understand its basically international character. In fact, it has followed international socialism all around the globe. One of the most definite characteristics of fascism is its international quality. 6/22/1971. The trends toward monopoly capital began effectively just after the close of the Civil War in America. Prior to its emergence, bourgeois democratic rule could be said to have been the predominant political force inside American society. As monopoly capital matured, the rule of the old bourgeois democracy faded in process. As monopoly capital forced out the small dispersed factory setup, the new corporativism assumed political supremacy. Monopoly capital can in no way be interpreted as an extension of old bourgeois democracy. The forces of monopoly capital swept across the Western world in the first half of this century, but they did not exist alone. Their opposite force was also at work, i.e., international socialism. Lenin's and Fanon's national wars of liberation, guided not by the national bourgeois, but by the people, the ordinary working class people. At its core, fascism is an economic rearrangement. It is international capitalism's response to the challenge of international scientific socialism. It developed from nation to nation out of differing levels of traditionalist capitalism's dilapidation. The common feature of all instances of fascism is the opposition of a weak socialist revolution. When the fascist arrangement begins to emerge in any of the independent nation states, it does so by default. It is simply an arrangement of an established capitalist economy, an attempt to renew, perpetuate, and legitimize that economy's rulers by circumflexing and weighing down, diffusing a revolutionary consciousness pushing from below. Fascism must be seen as an episodically logical stage in the socio-economic development of capitalism in a state of crisis. It is the result of a revolutionary thrust that was weak and miscarried, a consciousness that was compromised. When revolution fails, it's the fault of the vanguard parties. It is clear that class struggle is an ingredient of fascism. It follows that where fascism emerges and develops, the anti-capitalist forces were weaker than the traditionalist forces. This weakness will become even more pronounced as fascism develops. The ultimate aim of fascism is the complete destruction of all revolutionary consciousness. 6/23, 1971. Our purpose here is to understand the essence of this living, moving thing so that we will understand how to move against it. This observer is convinced that fascism not only exists in the USA, but has risen out of the ruins of a once eroded and dying capitalism, phoenix-like, to its most advanced and logical arrangement. One has to understand that the fascist arrangement tolerates the existence of no valid revolutionary activity. It has programmed into its very nature a massive, complex, and automatic defense mechanism for all our old methods for raising the consciousness of a potentially revolutionary class of people. The essence of a USA totalitarian socio-political capitalism is concealed behind the illusion of a mass participatory society. We must rip away its mask. Then the debate can end, and we can enter a new phase of struggle based on the development of an armed revolutionary culture that will triumph. On May 14, 1787, the Constitutional Convention, with George Washington presiding officer, the work of framing the new nation's constitution proceeded with 55 persons, and only 2 were not employers. There have been many booms and busts in the history of capitalism in this nation and across the Western Hemisphere since its formation. The accepted method of pulling the stricken economy out of its stupor has always been to expand. It was pretty clear from the outset that the surplus value factor eventually leads to a point in the business cycle when the existing implementation of the productive factors makes it impossible for the larger factor of production, labor, to buy back the fruits of its labor. This leads to what has been erroneously termed overproduction. It is, in fact, underconsumption. The remedy has always been to expand, to search out new markets and new sources of cheaper raw materials to recharge the economy, the imperialist syndrome. Conflicts of interest develop, of course, between the various Western nations and eventually lead to competition for these markets. The result is always an ever-increasing international centralization of the various capitalists' elites, worldwide cartels, international telegraphic unions, now International Telecommunications Union, Universal Postal Union, transportation, agriculture, and scientific syndicates. Before World War I, there were 45 or 50 such international syndicates, not counting the purely business cartels. The international quality of capitalism is not happenstance. It is clearly in the interests of the ruling class to expand and unite. I am one Marxist-Leninist Maoist Fanonist who does not completely accept the idea that the old capitalist competitive wars for colonial markets were actually willed by the various rulers of each nation, even though such wars stimulated their local economies and made it possible to promote nationalism among the lower classes. War, taken to the point of diminishing returns, weakens rather than strengthens the participants, and if the rulers of these nations were anything at all, they were good businessmen. Expansion, then, which often led unavoidably to war, was the traditional recourse in the solving of problems created by a vacuous, uncontrollable system, which never considered any changes in its arrangement, its essential dynamics, until it came under a very real, directly threatening challenge from below to its very existence. Fascism, in its early stages, is a rearrangement of capitalist implementation in response to a sharpening, threatening, but weaker egalitarian socialist consciousness. In regional or national economic crisis, the traditional remedies also include measures which stop just short of massive expansion on the international level. Traditional controls, short of expansion and war, have always existed in the form of government intervention, tariffs, public expenditure, government export subsidy, and limited control of the capital market and import licenses. And monopolies have always used government to help direct investment.
Let's begin the falsetto section of this vocal recording. When we're working the falsetto,
problems. In the appraisal of our work, it is one-sided to regard everything either as all positive or as all negative. To regard everything as positive is to see only the good and not the bad, and to tolerate only praise and no criticism. To talk as though our work is good in every aspect is at variance with the facts. It is not true that everything is good. There are still shortcomings and mistakes. But neither is it true that everything is bad, and that too is at variance with the facts. Here analysis is necessary. To negate everything is to think, without having made any analysis, that nothing has been done well and that the great work of socialist construction, the great struggle in which hundreds of millions of people are participating, is a complete mess with nothing in it worth commending. Although there is a difference between the many people who hold such views and those who are hostile to the socialist system, these views are very mistaken and harmful and can only dishearten people. It is wrong to appraise our work either from the viewpoint that everything is positive or from the viewpoint that everything is negative. End quote. Speech at the Chinese Communist Party's National Conference on Propaganda Work, March 12, 1957. Quote, in approaching a problem, a Marxist should see the whole as well as the parts. A frog in a well says, the sky is no bigger than the mouth of the well. That is untrue. For the sky is not just the size of the mouth of the well. If it said a part of the sky is the size of the mouth of a well, that would be true, for it tallies with the facts. End quote. On Tactics Against Japanese Imperialism, December 27, 1935. Quote, we must learn to look at problems all-sidedly, seeing the reverse as well as the obverse side of things. In given conditions, a bad thing can lead to good results, and a good thing to bad results. End quote. On the correct handling of contradictions among the people, February 27, 1957. Quote, while we recognize that in the general development of history, the material determines the mental, and social being determines social consciousness, we also, and indeed must, recognize the reaction of mental on material things, of social consciousness on social being, and of the superstructure on the economic base. This does not go against materialism. On the contrary, it avoids mechanical materialism and firmly upholds dialectical materialism. End quote. On Contradiction, August 1937. Quote, in seeking victory, those who direct a war cannot overstep the limitations imposed by the objective conditions. Within these limitations, however, they can and must play a dynamic role in striving for victory. The stage of action for commanders in a war must be built upon objective possibilities, but on that stage, they can direct the performance of many a drama, full of sound and color, power and grandeur. End quote. On Protracted War, May 1938. Quote, people must adapt their thinking to the changed conditions. Of course, no one should go off into wild flights of fancy or make plans of action unwarranted by the objective situation, or stretch for the impossible. The problem today, however, is that rightist conservative thinking is still causing mischief in many spheres and preventing the work in these spheres from keeping pace with the development of the objective situation. The present problem is that many people consider it impossible to accomplish things which could be accomplished if they exerted themselves. End quote. Preface to the Socialist Upsurge in China's Countryside, December 27, 1955. Quote, we should always use our brains and think everything over carefully. A common saying goes, knit your brows and you will hit upon a stratagem.
Same time tomorrow.
In other words, much